Hello and welcome to another episode of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 126 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, for Monday Gun Day, I stumbled across an article. It's actually at campussafetymagazine.com, and it sent me down a bit of a rabbit hole, but I thought it was worth sharing. And the article is called "Which States Let Teachers Carry Guns in School?" And it says the subtitle, "More than 30 states allow teachers to carry guns under certain conditions. Is your state on the list?" And I hadn't done a very broad look at this topic. I'd considered it here in Indiana, where I'm from. In Indiana, the legislature passed recently some legislation that allows actually, Indiana has allowed teachers to carry firearms at the discretion of the local school board. There aren't very many school boards that I'm aware of that actually allow teachers to carry firearms, but they nevertheless have had that power for quite some time. But more recently, the Indiana legislature provided training standards and funding for school boards to take advantage of for teachers that wanted to get training, and they could go through training that is arguably better than what police officers get. It'd be 40 hours of training, but dedicated to the school setting, whereas an officer gets training more broadly with the firearm. But it would also provide funding for the teachers to go through that training. And of course, it wouldn't force teachers to carry a firearm, but it would allow them to do so and enable the school district to put them through some pretty rigorous training. But I came across this article and it got me to thinking, how other states compare in this regard. And it's interesting. You can tell the slant of the article from the subtitle and the title itself, actually, which states let teachers, as if they have to, this is some privilege that you should ask Mother May I, government may I, exercise a fundamental individual right to protect myself and my loved ones. Does the state let teachers, and then again they use the word allow in the subtitles, more than 30 states allow teachers to carry guns under certain conditions. But this article, I'll put it up on the screen here. As you can see, once again, it's from campussafetymagazine.com, and of course I'll link to the article in the show notes, and it's by Amy Rock. It was published just recently, actually, May 10th, 2024. And the article lists the states. It says just 17 states and the District of Columbia have laws specifically prohibiting teachers from carrying guns. And of course, you can see the list there. If you're curious, I was a little bit surprised to see Alabama, although there's a caveat there. It says some school administrators are allowed to have a firearm if they complete the state's Century program, and there isn't a school resource officer available. And then, of course, there are a number of states which you would suspect would not allow, as they say, firearms in the schools, at least not in the hands of teachers. But then North Carolina, North Dakota, and West Virginia are some states that I might have thought might be on the more freedom-oriented side, but are not in this regard. And then, if you scroll further down, there's a section here where it says states where teachers can carry guns with permission from school authority, and it lists those 30 states that it was talking about in the subtitle. And those 30 states, one of which is Indiana, as you know from my opening commentary. But one in particular that caught my eye at the very bottom, states where teachers can carry guns with no restrictions. And there's one state listed, New Hampshire, which is, of course, the home of the Free State Project, a libertarian, or at least a libertarian oriented. I don't think it's a specific libertarian party affiliate, but it's a libertarian oriented organization that tries to recruit freedom minded people to the state of New Hampshire. So there's that inertia there, but New Hampshire apparently does not have restrictions on teacher carry. It says only students are prohibited. So I thought that was interesting, and I went and looked it up, and this is interesting because, of course, there is the Federal Safe School Zone or Gun Free School Zones Act, and I've got that here as well. I'm going to pull it up, and you'll see I went actually and looked up the original law, and you can tell it looks older here based on the way the document, the text and the font and stuff is laid out. But it's called it was originally part of the Crime Control Act of 1990. As always, the government passes law in a way that, with a name anyway, that sounds like irrefutable, like something that you couldn't possibly oppose. Crime Control Act. So of course, who wouldn't want to control crime, right? But not so surprisingly, as you would know if you've been paying attention to the way that the government works, and especially if you've been listening to this podcast, the law is not as good as it sounds, and of course, it creates more crimes in more ways that innocent people who are doing nothing of harm to society, can commit crimes. And if you go to page 56, you'll see it's a 180-page document of this Crime Control Act of 1990. If you go to page 56, and there you'll see the Gun Free School Zones Act of 1990, which, by the way, was signed into law by then President Bush, of course, a Republican. So Democrats aren't always on the only ones on the wrong side of freedom. As a matter of fact, Republicans are often the ones on the wrong side of freedom. But you can see here, it says in Section A, it shall be unlawful for any individual knowingly to possess a firearm at a place that the individual knows or has reasonable cause to believe is a school zone. So how do you reconcile the law in New Hampshire with the Federal Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990? So that really caught my attention. And of course, I was glad to see that New Hampshire had no prohibition, no restriction. But there's still this federal law out there. So what does that mean? And of course, if you're in New Hampshire, and you're curious about this, you should seek out the advice of a New Hampshire attorney. I'm not licensed to practice in New Hampshire. I am an attorney, but I'm only licensed to practice in Indiana. So definitely go talk to an attorney there if you're curious about this. But I looked it up, and there was a bill. It was House Bill 1178. And this is an article from schoollaw.com. And it says House Bill 1178 was signed into law by Governor Sununu in New Hampshire in June of 2022. And House Bill 1178 prohibits the state of New Hampshire, counties, towns, and school districts from enforcing or cooperating with any federal law, rule, regulation, or executive order, and this is interesting here, that is inconsistent with any law of this state regarding the regulation of firearms, ammunition, magazines, ammunition, feeding devices, firearms components, firearm supplies, or knives. So that's where this comes into play. So there's no prohibition on the carrying of firearms on school property under New Hampshire law, by anyone other than students, that is. And they passed this law that says state officials, counties, towns, school districts cannot enforce federal law, rules, regulations, or executive orders inconsistent with state law. So that's where this comes into play. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that federal law enforcement couldn't come into New Hampshire and enforce that particular law on the federal law, even though it's completely unconstitutional in my view. I don't think there is anything in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights that empowers the federal government to prohibit the possession of firearms on school property. I think it's ahistorical, it's unconstitutional, it's completely in opposition to the limited powers that our government was empowered with by the Constitution. Nevertheless, it doesn't mean that federal officials wouldn't try to enforce the federal law in New Hampshire, but state officials, officials within the state of New Hampshire, are not allowed to enforce the federal law. And I thought, man, this is really awesome. This is a great model for other states, not just with respect to the firearms possession on school property, but in many areas where the federal government has overstepped its bounds, which is almost immeasurable, almost innumerable, the number of ways that the federal government has done this. But I've talked about this a little bit before. The federal government cannot enforce all the laws it has on the books without the assistance of the states. And if the states refuse to comply through nullification, through state nullification, the federal government is powerless, has very little power to enforce the laws on their books. They don't have the manpower to do it. And so I thought, man, this is a great example that New Hampshire is setting here. They're the only state like this. And I'm going to go back to the campus safety article here. Of course, this article, if you read on down, suggests that teachers don't need to carry. It's an unfair responsibility to add to their plate, so on and so forth. But one thing that I think is crucial to understand here is that active shooters, people who engage in mass public killings, the number of victims goes down dramatically based on the swiftness of the response. And oftentimes, and you saw this in Uvalde, you saw this in Parkland, the law enforcement response is completely inadequate, disastrous. And if there were an armed teacher present that could stop the killer within seconds, within minutes, that would dramatically reduce the number of victims, the number of people killed. And I've got a graphic here, an image I want to share from crimeresearch.org. I think this is a key point to understand. Crimeresearch.org, of course, is run by John Lott, Crime Prevention Research Center, and he published recently an article, an updated information on mass public shootings from 1998 through 2023, and one of the graphics that he shows here is percent of mass public shootings between 1950 and October 25th, 2023 in gun-free zones. And it shows 94% of mass public shootings occurred in gun-free zones. So by far, the single largest factor in these mass public shootings is that they occur, or commonality, I should say, is that they occur in gun-free zones. And if there is just one or two good guys to respond, even if only a few teachers decide to avail themselves of the responsibility of protecting themselves and the people around them, I believe that school shootings would be dramatically decreased, and at least, if not decreased in the frequency, at least decreased in the severity of the harm. But nevertheless, I think that these mass killers, these psychopaths, would be more reluctant if they knew that the school, and obviously John Lott talks about this as well. If I can find the article, I'll link to it in the show notes. They often consider whether or not, when they choose a school or a target, whether or not guns are allowed there. One of the manifestos, I believe it was the Nashville mass killing, where the manifesto from the killer indicated that they chose this particular school over another because it was an easier target. And so I think that schools that chose to have armed teachers would be far less vulnerable, and the killers would just simply go somewhere else or nowhere at all. So I think this is key, and I'll link to this, like I said, in the show notes, this image along with the website where this image is sourced from. Again, it's crimeresearch.org. It's John Lott's work. So I share this with you, like I said, this article, going back to this campus safety article, because I think it's interesting. And I think that, I just had my first son in December. My wife and I were blessed with a baby boy. And I often think about how we will raise him, what sort of education we want him to receive. I think about all of the children who are attending schools daily, not just government schools, but private schools as well, and how vulnerable they are. Even though it's rare for school shootings to occur, even though they seem relatively common, the risk is still relatively low. But just how simple it would be. Like I said, here in Indiana, the legislature has allotted funding for these school boards to avail themselves of by sending teachers who wanted this responsibility to training, to train themselves to be, arguably more well-trained than police officers, than school resource officers with respect to responding to a mass shooting event in a school. And I think that they could train something like 30 or 40 teachers for every school resource officer salary. It's incredible, so that it would magnify the response far beyond what could be provided with one school resource officer. And I think that would go a long way to protecting, people who can't defend themselves, to the children that we are sending to these schools. So something to think about. New Hampshire's model, I think, exemplifies something else that I'm interested in as well, and that's this notion or idea of nullification, which I think can occur at the state level and also at the individual level. And that's just this idea that for any law that the federal government or any government engages in beyond its authority, if you just refuse to comply, the government, if enough people, if enough states, if enough individuals refuse to comply, the federal government would be powerless to enforce it. And I'm going to share with you here the 10th Amendment Center page. They have a page dedicated to nullification, and the 10th Amendment Center has a lot of great folks there. Michael Bolden is the primary person behind it, and you should follow him if you don't already on Twitter or on X. He's also got a 10th Amendment Center page on YouTube and Facebook. Great content, especially with respect to this concept of nullification. And you'll see here that I'm going to share it here on the screen. There you go. You should see it now. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com. And he starts out here. He says, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison first formalized the principles of nullification in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798. While Jefferson called it the rightful remedy to federal overreach, Madison put it in a different way, saying a state is duty bound to interpose to arrest the progress of the evil. So not only is it something they could or maybe should engage in, they were duty bound, in Madison's view, to interpose, to arrest, to stop the progress of the encroachment of the government. Jefferson and Madison were the first to propose nullification specifically, but they didn't create the idea. In fact, the strategies and principles date back to before the American Revolution. Colonists used nullification strategies to force Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. And during the Virginia Ratifying Convention, George Nicholas said that if Congress were to exercise any power not expressly granted to it, the state of Virginia would be exonerated from it, implying that the state would have the authority to ignore or block unconstitutional acts. Nullification is a fundamental part of the American political system. But what exactly does it mean? There are two definitions. One is legal. When a court strikes down a law, it literally wipes it off the books. But there is also a practical definition, to make something of no value or consequence. When we talk about nullification happening today, we generally mean it in the practical sense, to end the practical effect of a federal act. Here is a succinct definition of nullification as we apply it. Any act or set of acts which has as its result a particular law being rendered legally null and void or unenforceable in practice. Madison gave us a blueprint on how to do this in Federalist Number 46. He suggested 4 steps to take on, counteract, and stop federal programs, whether warrantable or unwarrantable, the most significant being a refusal to cooperate with the officers of the Union. The federal government involves itself in almost every aspect of life, but depends on state assistance to do almost everything. If states refuse to help, it becomes nearly impossible for the feds to enforce their laws or implement their programs. We can use this strategy to undermine and nullify all kinds of federal acts and practice, from warrantless spying to gun control to plant prohibition and more. So there you go. That's the little introduction there to nullification on the 10th Amendment Center website. And I think that's exactly what's going on here in New Hampshire. That New Hampshire has a formalized policy of nullification with respect to federal gun control on school grounds. And I think that's awesome. I think that's a great example for other states to follow. I just hope that other states have the bravery, the gumption, and the fortitude to do so. And not just with respect to gun-free school zones. But if you go down the 10th Amendment Center website, scroll down, you'll see that they have a number of articles about nullification if you want to dive deeper into that topic, including anti-commandeering, which I've mentioned before, and a number of other practices or practical ways that states can engage in nullification. All right, well, I hope that's where I'll leave it with that topic for today. Mike and I will be attending the NRA annual meeting next week. We will be in Dallas to attend the member meeting there. I'm sure that will be interesting. I'm sure there will be some developments there with respect to the sort of the reformation of the NRA. Of course, the Four for Reform were elected to the NRA Board of Directors, including Jeff Knox, who I had on the podcast a number of episodes ago. I'm sure that I'll try to meet up with him while I'm down there and chat with him and get some insight. And Mike and I will be sure to report back what we learn while we're at the NRA annual meeting. And before I close up here, I want to end with a quote. And this is a quote from Aldous Huxley. And this quote goes along with a theme that I talk about a lot on this podcast, and that's that freedom dies with apathy. And he says, most human beings have an almost infinite capacity for taking things for granted. And I think that's especially true when times are good, when we've reaped the reward of freedom and stood on the backs of previous generations who have worked so hard to create freedom. And unfortunately, the tide has turned significantly, and government has encroached on our freedoms in many, many ways. And I think that if we take for granted the freedoms that we currently have, we could lose those as well. So don't fall into this trap. Don't become apathetic. You have to fight for it. You have to fight for freedom, not only for yourself, but for future generations. As I said, as I used to say in the intro, it's not something that's passed on in the bloodstream. It's something that you have to fight for, or it will die with apathy. All right, everybody, I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you learned a little something. I'll link to all these resources in the show notes. And keep an eye out for next week's episode. Hopefully we can record one while we're in Dallas. If not, we'll record one shortly after we get back from Dallas. And of course, look forward to bringing you the next episode. And until the next time, don't forget to like and subscribe to help us spread the message of freedom. As always, you can find us on YouTube, Facebook, Rumble, and all the most popular podcast streaming platforms. You can also find us on X and at forgeoffreedom.com. Until next time, everybody, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Forge of Freedom. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss a future episode. For more information or to connect with Alex, you can go to forgeoffreedom.com or follow him on Twitter at Forge of Freedom. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.